Hey guys, do you remember this? Not Yunaka, but the accessory thing she came with. It's been about an entire year since the introduction of aided heroes, which may shock some people as we didn't really get a whole lot of them over the past 12 months or so. Between the introduction of the asset gimmick up until now, we've had a grand total of 3 aided heroes in Reagan, Dagger, and Yunaka. And 2 of them were right when they were introducing the asset gimmick into the game from last September and October respectively, followed by Yunaka in February of this year, and that's all we really had. Compare that to ascended units, rearms, and attuned. We had at least 10 ascended units, 12 rearms, and 9 attuned units in their first respective year. And for what it's worth, they didn't have to plan around as many unit types back when they were first introducing them. But to say this asset gimmick didn't land as well with the player base as it could have is probably an understatement. I don't think it's a stretch to say that there was a lot going against it from the offset. The aided gimmick was effectively another attempt at ascended, where you could essentially get a consumable one-time stat increase for any ally of your choosing and an accessory alongside the aided hero you pull. The key differences, however, amounted to allowing players to get as many aided buffs as the amount of aided units you pulled, rather than once per hero with ascended, which can let other units use aided accessories, as well as being a stat increase of 1 to every single stat instead of an extra boon to any stat of your choice. Aided being a Spectrum 1 stat buff is fine, but it really has no bearing on any unit it's given to, although I find that to be one of the least of its problems. That said, I do think the accessory is okay at least, but it was definitely just a cosmetic novelty more than anything, and that's all it really had to offer. It didn't even have the benefit of fodder duplication that the previous 2 gimmicks had, and that probably hurt it a bit as well, especially perception-wise, as they were also limited pool units just for the sake of it. I think if it at least had the ability to duplicate fodder like the past 2 asset gimmicks, then it probably would have been okay enough, and I understand why they decided to try again with the stat asset gimmick, seeing as florets were limited, and they probably wouldn't have been able to retroactively update how ascended units worked without upsetting a lot of people, but I don't think people really care that much about aided heroes because it's super inconsequential, and despite everything going against it, I actually did like the asset gimmick a good bit. Not because it was a really cool gimmick or interesting in any capacity, but because it was inconsequential. It wasn't nearly on the same level as every other gimmick up until that point. Ascended units being the first of their kind, while having generally good appeal in the beginning, made it work for many at the time. Even if it was just an extra boon at the end of the day, it was desirable enough for people to buy into it. In fact, some people do prefer the extra boon of their choosing over a flat Spectrum 1 even now. Then a year later with rearms, where even now people still love them, they help out older units while serving other purposes including fodder duplication and being usable even after being foddered for their skills. It's a gimmick that will most likely remain in demand just by their very nature. Even attuned units find themselves in a similar position because people do love new skills to pass around for whoever they want, and similar to that of rearms, they can also duplicate fodder and don't go away when being foddered, so they do have as much value, if not more, than rearms at times. Aided heroes, meanwhile, really lack sufficient enough value as they currently stand. Attuned and rearmed units do fulfill that because of everything they contribute as a gimmick hero, even if you want to argue that a lot of what they contribute isn't necessary or not as good as it may seem, especially since it's getting harder to duplicate newer skills that don't have accessible pre-fodder or they launch as brand new tier 4 skills. The fact that many players buy into them means it did set out on what it needed to do. They may not make your super outdated favorite super duper good, or maybe it would, who knows, but there is a perceived amount of value that exists for them. It's also why I don't think florets are enough in demand these days. They've definitely been devalued to the point where I can't see them being printed on another banner, especially since it's been over a year since the last ascended unit. I'd be shocked if they printed another one. They moved them over to orb packs for a reason, and that reason is probably due to it being a better way to get people buying into them, even if it boils down to artificial scarcity or fear of missing out. The perceived value of it just isn't high enough anymore. But even so, not having to worry about another new addition to the game was really nice, but that's also most likely the reason it didn't work out for them. Outside of the standard good unit, good fodder aspect that any unit really can have, they didn't offer anything that had enough perceived value to stand out. Honestly, I wouldn't even be surprised if they had more plans for some units to be aided, but ultimately repurpose them as a result of the overall reception. Of course, that's mostly speculation, so I don't want to pass it off as the absolute reason behind it. It's just weird seeing how underutilized they were over the past year, especially since it is their first year in the game. Or maybe they ran out of accessory options already. That'd be hilarious. But yeah, in all seriousness, I do think that's what it really boils down to at the end of the day. Spectrum 1 in an accessory wasn't perceived as good enough value or investment to enough of the player base, which is why we haven't seen any since Yunaka. Although if they do bring it back, then, you know, egg on my face. I'll gladly admit I was wrong there. Still, I do think they don't have enough value as they currently stand, and it's not like they have a lot of incentive to make more of them at the moment. And part of that probably also has to do with power creep. The unfortunate truth is that we do care about power creep to some extent, but that shouldn't be conflated with additions that push the envelope way too far. There's a pretty sizable difference between a steady incline to power creep and then spikes with massive outlier units and skills that completely warp the game around them. I think we can agree with that much. Ideally, it can remain as a steady incline, even with asset gimmicks, but that's probably wishful thinking. Ask anyone about it and they'll point out the jump from Fleeting Echo to Soaring Echo in the span of a few months. Still, with how aided has been, I think they're going to release more gimmicks that fall more in line with rearms and attuned units, more so than ascended and aided. And really, I don't think any stat-related gimmick could work out these days, and it's probably why they attached it to accessories to begin with. But that begs the question, what is a good enough asset gimmick that has enough perceived value for people to bite into? Perhaps something that isn't nearly on the same level as an emblem ring, but good enough in its own right to justify its existence. Even if it's just a weaker rearmed or a weaker attuned unit, I can see that still working out. What would that even look like, and would it even be good enough for people to pull? Honestly, you have me beat. I really could not tell you what that would even look like to begin with, but I do know that despite any problems we might have with how IS may handle things in the game, you gotta admit they do keep things interesting. Now, one thing I do expect eventually are bond rings, and that's most likely just because of how successful emblem heroes are. I wouldn't never expect them to be on the same level as an emblem hero, of course, but I do think most of us would buy into a weaker ring just because it is a ring still. Although I say that as if they wouldn't eventually release something nuts onto a hypothetical bond ring. Even if it's just an existing inheritable skill like they already do with attuned units, I do think that would be enough for many, especially since rings don't have any restrictions beyond the unit who comes with the ring, since they can't use it themselves. Rearmed weapons and attuned skills can't be equipped on units with PRF skills active, so they would have to get rid of it in order to use either of them. With rings, that's not really the case. There's no restriction on that otherwise. I definitely think it would work out for them. Like, don't tell me you wouldn't pull for a bond ring, even if all it did was grant attack speed finish, or perfect attack speed, or fatal smoke, or anything. Please don't tell me you wouldn't. I have to make a valid point here. Personally, I've been wanting a Dragonflower gimmick hero that just helps you max out any character's Dragonflowers, given how many it requires for older units at this point. I'd probably build more units if it didn't cost me over 4,000 Dragonflowers. Not that I think it would work out as an asset gimmick, since it pretty much falls into the same issue as Ascended and Aided, but it sure would be nice, especially since it would be another inconsequential option. But I don't think they do it just because of that. Otherwise, Y slots, I guess. They already got X slots, so why not? Like I mentioned, I don't really know what they could do, and I don't doubt they'll introduce something enticing enough for people to buy into. That said, I think most people would be fine with them not attempting a new gimmick every single year. At least for the time being, I would imagine most people would rather them double up on rearms and attuned units instead, as they continually have the most widespread appeal among the player base, especially with the rearmed units, since there's always going to be a weapon type that is in need of an extra new addition. Rearms just kind of fulfill that, even if they are kind of generic at this point with the same cookie cutter effects that you've pretty much seen over the past several arcanes. They're not exciting, but they do work, and people still like them because of it. They haven't ran their course in a way that extra stats did, and with how much things can change in the game, even in the span of a single month, people will always look for new ways to update units with new inheritables and echo skills. I think they could actually get away with it for a single year if they really didn't want to make a new asset gimmick, although that would mean less room for newer units to get in, which would suck, but I also don't know if that would have been something they pursued regardless due to general demand. Still, I also completely understand why they continue to come up with new yearly gimmicks just from a business standpoint. Continuing to diversify and shake things up is important so that they aren't wholly relying on their pre-existing options. Imagine if they were still relying on ascended units for years without introducing any new asset gimmicks like rearms or attunes. It's an avenue that could stop bringing in enough revenue for them, and aka shrink in value over time. And in the case of florets, it probably did, which is why they only show up on orb packs now. Less and less people would stop caring about it, and the lack of anything new will eventually get stale for many, which is why introducing new things often enough makes sense. Being over-reliant on one or two things is just not a good idea. Besides aided units, we got the introduction of Emblem heroes last year, and it had the complete opposite reception. It was an immediate hit for most people, to the point where they started hiding when they would release a new one on the monthly calendars, because it was cannibalizing the other banners in those respective months. So continually innovating and keeping things fresh does have its merits, and if it pays off, then they're pretty much set for a good while, as seen with Emblem heroes, rearmed units, and attuned heroes. And in a lot of ways, it's probably necessary for them to do this every single year, even if, presumably, most people would be fine with them sticking with the current ones they have right now. Rearms and attunes are just that in demand at the moment. Worst case scenario, they go back to what works, return to the drawing board to figure out what else could appeal to people, and then they try again. That's just the way it goes, and for a near 9-year-old gacha game, it'd be unexpected of them not to innovate at this point. But at the end of the day, the game wouldn't be what it is without all these new approaches to keep things fresh. For better or worse, if we do get a new asset gimmick this month and it shakes up more of the game, then I could see it working out for them a good bit. And if it doesn't, then there's always next year. Although I really would not mind another negligible asset gimmick again. That just means I get to save orbs, which is probably why they're not going to do it.